All right, here we go. Take out this handout here. It's suitable for a tattoo. I don't think it would all fit on your arm, but I have to put it on your chest or something. All right, you want to follow along here. All right, here we go. Today is Easter Sunday. Paul says in the second reading today that if all that we have in this life is Christ, and if Christ didn't rise from the dead, then we of all people are to be most pitied. The Christian religion rises and falls on this day, this event today. We're called Christians because Christ rose from the dead on the first Easter Sunday morning. So I thought it might be a good opportunity to sort of review this a little bit today. So I have the scorecard, so follow along. First of all, let's start with the bare facts. What's the bare fact? The bare fact is this. Did Jesus live?
Yes.
If Jesus didn't live, then there's nothing to talk about. We can go home now, right? So how do we know Jesus lived? All right. Every once in a while, you're watching the History Channel, and there's some guy with the hair who's telling you that UFOs speak to him on a regular basis, and he also happens to know that Jesus didn't exist. Well, this is an eccentric viewpoint. I usually point to this book. This is Will Durant, The Story of Civilization. Anybody heard of this before? It's an 11-volume set. Will Durant's entire life work went into writing this 11-volume set. I actually read the thing. It's taken me about 20 years to go through all 11 volumes. And this volume is volume 3, and the name of it is what? Christ, or Caesar, and what? Christ? Caesar? Okay. Will Durant is not a Bible-carrying Christian. We'd call him a secular historian. And he treats Christ just as real as Caesar or any other character. Again, how do we know that anyone lived? Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He was shot April 14th, 1865, died the next day at 7:22 a.m. How do we know that Abraham Lincoln really lived? Well, it's subject to the normal, we don't have any videotape of him, but we have people that knew Lincoln, people that talked to Lincoln. We have Lincoln's writings himself. Same thing with any person in history. Jesus more than fits that requirement. There was a person named Jesus. So we got that out of the way. So then now that he lived, Jesus died. So let's start our chart here. Jesus was betrayed on Maundy, Thursday. He was sentenced to death by Pontius Pilate and crucified, led through the streets, public degradation ritual. He's crucified on Golgotha. And what happened? Was he really dead? Well, yes, he was dead. How do we know? Well, a couple of proofs. First of all, Pontius Pilate sent a centurion out in Mark chapter 15 to verify that Jesus was dead. Now, why is that an important thing? A centurion is a Roman soldier. He's an officer. If a Roman officer would come back and lie to Pilate and say he was dead, but Jesus wasn't really dead, well, what's the penalty for lying to Pontius Pilate about something like this? The death penalty. The Romans believe in law and order and peace and quiet. Okay? So the centurion. Now, would a centurion know a dead person when they see one? Talk to somebody who drives like an EMS truck or something. You can tell a deceased person by looking at him. These Roman soldiers are experts in death. They do this all the time. They know a dead person when they see one. But wait, I don't believe it. Okay? When in John chapter 19, verse 34, Pontius Pilate sent soldiers out at the request of the Jewish leaders in the temple to break the legs of the men on the crosses so that the bodies would be taken down before sunset that night because it's a holy day. Okay? So they break the legs of the thief on the right, they break the legs of the thief on the left, and what happens? They take a lance and they spear Jesus under the fifth rib, and what happens? Blood and water comes out. Blood and water is a death certificate. Okay? You don't survive a wound like this. Blood and water means he's really dead. So was he dead? Yes, he was. Now, is there an option here? Yeah, you can say he wasn't dead. The Quran, Surah 4, 157 says that Jesus didn't die on the cross, that he merely swooned. Some people, like Hugh Schoenfeld, he wrote a thing called The Passover Plot years ago, and the idea was he was given a drug to make it look like he was dead, but he wasn't actually dead. Now, is that true?
No.
Well, how do you know?
The blood in the water.
Well, there's a way of knowing about this, okay? When you're crucified, the person has to, they're like this, they have to stand up in order to exhale and drop down in order to inhale. So when they're like this, if you break the legs of the person, they would suffocate, they die within a minute or two. That's why they break the legs of the thief on the left and on the right. So the idea of giving a drug to simulate death where you can't stand up and breathe, you would have died from giving a drug to simulate death, okay? So the swoon theory. Or maybe he wasn't really dead, but he escaped. This is my favorite one, you know. I've been reading about World War II and World War I, and, you know, there are people out there that will say things like, Hitler escaped the bunker and he went to Argentina, he's hiding in South America. Well, how do we know if that's true or not? Well, Hitler is not the kind of a person that would keep a low profile, if you know what I mean. Like if he went to Argentina, he would probably want to, you know, get his own shortwave station or something, or he's not going to like disappear. Same thing with Jesus. If he was given a drug, and if somehow he would manage to live through it, he's not the kind of a person who's going to live a quiet life somewhere. He goes to the villages in Florida and drives a golf cart, right? So he's not the kind of person who would disappear. So is he dead? Yes, he's dead. All right, now that we have the dead body of Jesus, what do we do with him? Well, you have to take him down off the cross, right? And he was taken down before sundown on Friday night. And he was given a hasty burial. By who? If you read Luke and John, Joseph of Arimathea, with the help of Nicodemus, went to Pilate and begged for the body of Jesus. They took the body down off the cross and they buried him quickly in a rich man's tomb near the site of Golgotha, near the site of the execution. And they rolled the stone in the front. Now, why did they have to bury him in a hurry? Well, because it has to be done before sundown on Friday night, because Sabbath begins when 3 stars are visible. That's the next day. So he's buried very rapidly. Who is Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus? These aren't just anybody. Nicodemus is a member of the Sanhedrin. That would be like saying a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a senator from New York buried Jesus. In other words, he's a prominent, well-known person. And the same thing with Joseph of Arimathea. He's a well-known person. He's a person that everyone knew. So when they say, you know, yes, we took the body of Jesus down, that is a credible witness. It's a high-standing person that has no reason to lie. In fact, Nicodemus is a Jew, a member of the Sanhedrin. He would have every reason to lie, to say that, oh no, it never happened. Instead, he is an eyewitness. He's a hostile witness, in other words. So he's buried, he's placed in the tomb. So we have the death, we have the burial. Now, some people claim, well, he wasn't buried. His body was just taken off the cross and thrown in a ditch somewhere, and dogs ate him. Right? This is a real theory that's out there. Well, is that true? Well, then what's all the stuff in the Bible about the tomb and the burial and all that about? You have to explain that somehow. Okay? So that's a ridiculous thing. Or he was not dead. He swooned, and what happened to him? He was buried alive. Now, what's wrong with that one? If you've ever seen an accident, a car accident, what do? You take the person and you take the victim out of the car and you put a blanket on them to keep them warm so they don't go into shock. Why is shock a bad thing? It can kill you. Okay, so here's Jesus. He sustains a brutal scourging, a brutal beating. He's led through the streets. He's beaten. He's nailed to a cross. You have a major blood loss. The crown of thorns on his head. After being hanging on the cross and being presumed dead, but he's not really dead, he's taken off the cross, and then what do they do to him? They put 100 pounds of spices on him. So his whole back is ripped open, his side, wounded side, and they're going to put 100 pounds of. Do you ever work in the kitchen before? No, we probably haven't. Well, sometimes in the kitchen you cut your finger, right? And what happens? You get like vinegar or something. What does that feel like?
Stings.
Yeah, well imagine if your whole back is ripped open and you have 100 pounds of spices packed on you. That alone would kill you, okay? And then you're placed underground, 57 degrees, nice and cold. What's that going to do to you? Well, you'll die of shock, okay? So the idea that he's buried alive that's not a plausible way. It's too complicated, right? And then, okay, so assume he is buried alive, right? He's still alive, and the question is, who moved the stone out of the way? This stone is 1.5 to 2 tons. 1 ton is 2,000 pounds. So it's a 4,000 pound round stone that's rolled in front of the tomb. Well, who moved it? Did Jesus move it from the inside? Right, you have to get into some supernatural thing that somehow he blew the door, or somehow he is able to he is wounded, severely wounded. He looks like he's dead. He's trying to pry the door out with what? There weren't any tools in there. Or who helped him? Well, maybe the disciples helped him to escape. This is my favorite way of explaining this, right? So here we go. When Jesus died, who's there? Well, the disciples aren't there. Peter denied him 3 times. The rest of where are they? They're hiding in the upper room. Why is it that the women had to go to the tomb? Because the boys were afraid. So they were hiding. So these are the men who are going to say, okay, let's put black stuff on our face. We're going to climb on our stomachs like this. We're going to sneak up on the tomb. I have some ropes. We're going to lower you down. We're going to take pry bars. We're going to roll the stone back. We're going to take out the not dead body of Jesus, and we're going to give him smelling salts, and that'll wake him up right away, right? So they're going to execute a conspiracy like this. And think about how odd this would be. And so if Jesus was dead and they just stole the body, and then they went and said, okay, look, we have to let's get our story together here. He's not dead. We saw him walking around. Yeah, let's make that up. Well, is that a plausible thing? The answer is no. Why is that? Well, all of the apostles died. How do they die? As martyrs for their faith. There's no record of any of them ever saying, wait a minute, before you kill me, I just want to say one thing. We made it all up. Haha, I was kidding. No, they all believed in the resurrection of Christ up to the point that they're willing to die for it. Are you willing to die for something that you just made up? Yeah, I believe UFOs are real. I'm willing to die for it. Probably not, no. So the same thing here, okay? So the disciples, they didn't lie. They told the truth, okay? And none of them ever recanted. Okay, so let's go back up here then. So he's buried, and the question is then, if he's dead, he's in the tomb, how come the body's gone? Today's gospel lesson, the women go to the tomb and the body's gone. Well, first of all, let's start. We have 5 options here. The first option would be hallucinations. Now, I know many people who live in Woodstock, and I know that hallucinations were a big thing in the 1960s, right? But hallucinations don't happen with massive groups of people. Maybe an individual subjective hallucination might be possible, right? But to have 500 people see the risen Lord. This is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Over 500 people, and some of them are still alive. In other words, go ask them. Check it out. Paul's writing this. And in the New Testament, there are 10 recorded post-resurrection appearances. How many? 10. Recorded, right? Now, did he appear more than that during the 40 days between resurrection and ascension day? Yeah, but they're all not written down. There are 10 recorded post-resurrection appearances. Okay? And there are multiple people, different times, different places. These are not hallucinations. Okay? So the second thing, well, maybe the Romans stole the body. Okay? So Pontius Pilate, he says, I'm feeling bad about sentencing the innocent man to death. Let's go and steal the body. Okay? Now, is that a plausible thing? It's a very strange thing. Why would you execute a guy and then give permission to have him buried and then change your mind and break into the tomb and steal the body? Again, of course, what would be the way of refuting Christianity? Just produce the body of Jesus, that's all, right? Would the Romans do something like this? Yeah, very often they would. Typically, if you're crucified, they would leave your body on the cross as a statement that you don't mess with the Romans. It's like state terrorism. So the idea that the Romans stole the body, that's really a ridiculous thing. Or maybe, how about this one? The Jews stole the body. Now, why would the Jewish religious leaders in the temple steal the body? Again, the same thing. To refute the Christian religion, the death, burial, resurrection of Christ, just produce the body of Jesus, and the argument is solved, right? Okay? Or the third one would be the disciples stole the body. Did they steal the body? Well, again, no. Why would they do that? That goes back to the idea of they helped Jesus, who wasn't really dead, break out of the tomb. Okay? So, again, the way of refuting it is to produce the body. Now, let's go back up here. In the Gospel of Matthew 27, verses 65 through 66, Pilate set a watch outside of the tomb. What does that mean? The stone is rolled in front of the tomb. They put a seal on the tomb. And what's the penalty for disturbing the grave or breaking a governor's seal? The death penalty. So in other words, would the disciples risk their life to liberate the dead body of Jesus, or would anyone else? The answer is no. So, and what is a Roman watch? It's 5 or 6 heavily armed men. Okay? So, if the disciples stole the body, what are they going to do? They're going to take on professional Roman soldiers that are well armed and well trained and well equipped. So in the Gospel of Matthew 28, the Jewish religious leaders, when they heard that the tomb was empty, they said, here's what you do. Tell people that the disciples stole the body while you were sleeping. Now, why is that a problem? Well, a Roman soldier that falls asleep on duty, what is the penalty for that? Yeah, you don't want to think about this. Basically, they throw a flammable fluid on you, light you on fire, as an example to the rest of, because a Roman soldier who falls asleep on duty risks the life of all the men who are sleeping. And if you have an order to guard something like this, you don't fall asleep and you don't permit your mission to be busted, which is the tomb was broken into and the body stolen. In other words, if the Romans actually said that to their superiors, they would be in big trouble. Okay? So the guards, all right. The next one. I like this one, and this fits in with today's gospel lesson. The women went to the wrong tomb. Now, in today's gospel lesson, which is Luke chapter 24, beginning with verses 1 through 12, the word tomb, the tomb, appears how many times? 4 times. Read it over again when you get home. The tomb, right? They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, right? So the word the tomb appears 4 times in this little one gospel lesson in Luke. Now, did the women go to the wrong tomb? Think about this. If one of your loved ones died and you bury the person in a cemetery, and the next day or two you go back to the grave, are you going to get the wrong tomb? When you lose a loved one, it's like one of the most traumatic events in your life. You tend not to forget things like this. So it's like, oh, I forgot my car keys. That you can understand. But a major event like the death of a loved one, they loved Jesus. And the women were there. They were at the tombside. They got the right tomb, right? And so then the question is, why were the women at the tomb? Okay, today's gospel lesson. Why did the women go to the tomb? Again, the apostles are safe and sound, locked up in the upper room. They're afraid to go out. Why? The typical Roman procedure is not only to take out the leader, Jesus, but also take out all of his followers to make sure this rebellious movement doesn't happen ever again. They want to destroy the movement. So they think they're going to be the next ones to be killed. They're afraid to go out. Phobia. They're locked up in the upper room. So who goes out? The women go out. Why is that? It's women's work to deal with the dead. Women get the job. And it says they brought spices. Where did the spices come from? That they had prepared. Evidently on Good Friday, as the sun is going down, the women went and bought the correct spices that you need to anoint the body of the loved one. So they had the spices ready to go. Why didn't they buy it on Saturday? It's the Sabbath day. So nothing happens on Saturday. The first opportunity to minister, to anoint the body of Jesus would be Easter Sunday morning as the sun is coming up. The Sabbath day is over, the next day is rising, and there they are at the tomb as the sun is rising. Women go in, and when they see the empty tomb, what do you think they thought? They didn't say, "No problem, it's a resurrection. I heard this in church somewhere." No, they assume that some lunatic or maniac has broken into the tomb and stolen the body of Jesus. The farthest thing from their mind is that he's risen from the dead. So what happens? Two men in dazzling white clothes, angels, angelos means messenger. Two messengers appear. And they lay the body out this way. There's two angels, one at the head, one at the feet. Two witnesses, not one opinion, two witnesses. And they testify. They said, "He is not here, he is risen." Remember, see that word in the text? Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified and on the third day rise again from the dead? The message is remember what Jesus promised. In the Gospels, he tells them 3 times what's going to happen to him. But it doesn't penetrate, because this is something that's never happened before in human history, where someone would be dead, buried, and be raised again on the third day. It didn't penetrate until after the resurrection. Remember what he told you. Remember. That's why we come to church today. We come to church today to remember that old story of the cross, of the empty tomb, of the women coming back. That's why we're here today, to remember the story, the two witnesses. And then they remembered his words as they returned, and they tell the 11, and the 11 don't believe it. Why is that? Well, there are 3 things here. This is called the criterion of embarrassment. What does that mean? Okay, we made the whole thing up. Now, if you made up a story like this, would you have women go to the empty tomb? Not me. I'd have Joseph of Arimathea and Peter, of course, because he's going to be the first pope, of course, and maybe Nicodemus and maybe, some other high-ranking men who would go to the tomb and verify that the tomb was empty. The fact that women are at the tomb is a ridiculous thing. That's like your weakest possible argument if you tried to convince people that the tomb is empty. You would say, women, who believes that? Remember, in the ancient world, it's a patriarchal society. Women are regarded as subject to hallucinations and delusions and emotional outbursts or something, right? But rational men, they never get it wrong. In other words, this is the wrong way to tell the story if you're going to lie. Okay? This is one of the reasons why we know it's true. You would, if you were going to lie, you wouldn't tell it this way. Okay? So the women go to the tomb. In addition, we have the criterion of enemy witnesses. What does that mean? The temple leaders, they don't like Jesus. That's why they handed him over to be crucified, handed him over to the Romans. The Romans, they don't like Jesus because they think he's going to start a revolution or something. So they don't like him either. But yet, you have the problem for the Jewish leaders and for the Romans that the tomb is empty. Well, that's not a good thing for them. So they verify the fact that the tomb is empty. So you have to figure out, well, what happened then? Okay? And then you have multiple attestation. In other words, you have multiple witnesses. You don't have one person who said, you wouldn't believe it, I saw a UFO. I saw the tomb was empty. No, you have multiple people that testify. Again, in the New Testament, there are 10 post-resurrection appearances recorded and many that are not recorded. Okay? Extremely important. All right, so here we go now. How do we know that Jesus really rose from the dead? The gospel is the death, the burial, the resurrection of Christ, the DBR. Always remember that. He died on Good Friday. He's buried before sundown. He stays in the tomb for 3 days. The women go to the tomb early Sunday morning, and the tomb is empty. And the two messengers said, "He is not here, he has risen." That's the proclamation of Easter. Now, did that proclamation end? No. The proclamation of the early church, read the entire New Testament, and then the early church fathers, and the history of the Christian religion. There are 2 billion people today that are Christians in the world of 7 billion people. Where did it start? You go back 2,000 years, you go back 1,000 years, you go back all the way back to 33 AD, that first Easter Sunday morning. We're in good company. We believe the witness. We believe the 2 men in dazzling, that he is not here, he is risen. We believe the women at the tomb. We believe the eyewitnesses. We believe that Jesus rose from the dead. That's the proclamation of Easter Sunday. And what does it do for us? Christ died and he defeated sin and death. And because Christ rose from the dead, we too someday shall be raised. Someday Christ is going to stand at your grave and say, "Come out." He's going to say your name and tell you to come out. Because Christ rose, we too shall be raised from the dead. Today is Easter Sunday. The death, the burial, and the resurrection of Christ. Indeed, it's something to celebrate and something to really think about. Amen.